This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. At some point, there's a good chance you might become a caretaker. Before I Forget is the story of life, love, and memory loss, and all the ups and downs of caregiving. It was inspired by author Tory Henwood Hoen's own experience. The story follows 26-year-old Cricket. As her father's Alzheimer's progresses, she decides to make a major life pivot, quitting her job and moving back home to be with him full-time. Today, we hear from the book's author and also the person who voiced the audiobook. Later this hour, we'll also learn about a Connecticut effort to make audiobooks more accessible. So joining us now is author and Connecticut native Tory Henwood Hoen. Her latest book is Before I Forget. Thank you so much, Tory, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I grew up listening to Connecticut Public Radio every morning, so This is a real thrill.
What a nice full circle. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the reasons why we love showcasing our local authors. So much talent here, and this is the space for you, really. And we'd love to start off by asking you to tell us a bit about how this story started for you. Who are some of the main characters that readers will be following, and what made you want to explore memory care?
So the seed of this story is based in my own life experience. My father had Alzheimer's. He was diagnosed when I was in my early 20s, and he ultimately died when I was in my early 30s. I was not his caregiver. My mom took care of him, but I spent a lot of time with them and was able to observe her and, witness how this disease affects a family. And it was sort of humming in the background of my early adulthood in those years and had a big impact on my life and my worldview and my outlook and my sense of myself in the world. So I didn't necessarily know at that point that I would write about it, but it was something that was always in the back of my mind. And once I began to think about what should my second novel be, this story just sort of began to emerge. And I began with the relationship between a father and daughter. So in my book, the daughter is Cricket. She's 26 and her father is Arthur and he's 74. I thought it would be interesting to look at those particular ages, a woman entering adulthood and a man at the end of his life, and the juxtaposition between them. And from there, take a look at how becoming a caregiver affects her and her sense of herself in the world. I think it's something like 1 in 4 Americans are acting as caregivers, unpaid caregivers. I think it's a really, really heroic thing to do, often unseen, uncompensated, but so many people assume that role at some point in their lives. So I wanted to take a look at a relatively young person stepping into that role and discovering herself and coming home to herself in the process.
And I wonder if it's also the personality of Cricket, age as well, where the book actually, there are many, many moments where it's really funny. And it's maybe it's not like laugh out loud funny, but there are some moments that's really, really humorous and comical. And I wonder if it's sort of that also a juxtaposition between this is an experience that's it's heavy, it's sad, it can be very depressing for a young person. But because of her own outlook, it made it, I don't want to say softer, but it was a really interesting perspective from a young person taking care of their dad.
Yeah, in my experience, that's just life, right? Like life is hard and it's also funny, often at the same time. So I wanted to sort of apply that lens to this book. I also, as a writer, I tend to err on the playful, whimsical side. So that's just me. And in taking on this topic, I spent a lot of time thinking about, can I write a book about Alzheimer's that's not a total downer, that's kind of fun to read and a bit of a page turner, that still does justice to the gravity of the disease, but that also shines a more optimistic light on it. And so that's why I created characters who I think have a good sense of humor, and the humor really comes through their personalities rather than, we're not making light of the disease, but their outlook allows them to have moments of levity and fun along the way. I thought that was important for me as a writer to be able to tell this story, but also hopefully gratifying for readers and people who have experienced Alzheimer's or dementia in their families. I think often the common narrative is that it's all about loss, it's devastating, it's heartbreaking, and all of that is true, but there can be fun and meaningful moments along the way as well.
Well, and of course, it sounds like there's so much intention behind trying to perhaps break out the typical narrative of stories like cognitive decline is very heartbreaking, but the way you did it, I feel like it didn't make it less heartbreaking, and perhaps it actually made it more because there's humor as a part of it, and readers will experience Arthur sort of pre-diagnosis and post-diagnosis, and a little bit of Cricket too before or when she was growing up versus when she's an adult. Why do you think it was important, or why was it important for you to be able to sort of explore the two, the pre and the post?
I really wanted to emphasize Arthur's humanity in particular. I didn't want him to be a stock character or someone who, now that he has a
I mean,
diagnosis,
he was also
he's
very funny.
yeah, I mean, he is someone who we learn in the book has always had a good sense of humor, doesn't take himself too seriously, and I wanted that core trait of his personality to persist. So it was important to me that he felt like a full character who, even though he's losing his sense of orientation in the world, he's still retaining a lot of his personality. I found that happened with my father too. When he had Alzheimer's, he didn't know who we were anymore, but he still was himself in many ways. And I think often narratives overlook the fact that can happen. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes people do experience major shifts in their personality and how they present in the world. But I think for the purposes of this narrative, I wanted to tell the story of someone who, on many levels, continues to be himself, even as he loses his grasp of reality. And in some ways, he is able to access different dimensions of himself and reinvent himself in certain ways. This is also a story of reinvention.
Well, and you describe memory loss not as a decline as much as it's a spiral down the drain. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's for many people, this is a slow motion disease. It can take course over the course of years. So it's sort of a one step forward, two step backwards kind of disease. One day you're very coherent. The next day you might backslide a little bit. So Cricket is able to witness that progression in her father. It can be really disorienting, both for the person who has the disease and those who are managing and taking care of them. But I think yeah, it's not a straightforward disease. It's not linear, and I think that's often true in life in general in terms of how we grow and change as humans. It's not a point A to point B, and I think Arthur and Cricket are both experiencing that reality in their own ways over the course of this book.
Well, and actually, just building on what you just mentioned, talking about this is also about the impacts of people surrounding or surrounded with Arthur, and Cricket is one of them. She has a sister, an older sister, and also her mom, and the parents are divorced, and so it does often feel like Cricket is also navigating her own journey, not just in caregiving, but also just as a human being. And you find moments where she is accepting. Sometimes she seems to be in denial of what's happening. And then you realize, oh, she's also trying to negotiate her own circumstances. So sort of what you just said now, like memory loss may not be so much as a literal loss, but transformation. Do you think this is a common experience where caregivers are also grieving the person that was? Because sometimes they still get glimpses of it, but it's just glimpses now.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a very multidimensional disease and experience for everyone involved. I think that's a point I want to underscore is that all of the above, all of the emotions, all of the experiences are often wrapped up in what it means to navigate this disease. I think for Cricket, the act of becoming a caregiver actually helps her to find purpose in her life. We learn in the book that she has experienced a tragedy in her teenage years that takes place at the lake where this book is set. So she's been bogged down by that and avoiding a lot of things because of that that tragedy. And in stepping into the caregiving role for her father, she comes closer to being able to understand her purpose, what she wants out of life. And so for her, it's a transformation that's very meaningful, which is not to say that it's not a difficult role to be in. And she certainly faces challenges, but it's clarifying for her. Yeah.
Well, and another character that I really enjoyed actually is Cricket's mom. And so you also learn she's kind of in and out, and it's almost a little bit of a flipped role in terms of what we traditionally know as a mom role versus a dad role. And I'm curious to hear about how you decided to develop mom, because I don't think she's a very typical mom character to read.
Yeah, I would say Cricket has always had a very natural relationship with her father. They were sort of kindred spirits. Her relationship with her mother is a bit more strained. Her mother, we learn, is sort of a hard-hitting businesswoman who came up in the 80s and 90s in New York in a man's world, took considerable time off to have her children, and then jumped back into the workplace. And her husband, Arthur, was on a different trajectory where he was sort of working his way towards early retirement so he could spend time in the woods. So the two of them are a stark contrast. And I think Cricket's mom would prefer if her daughters followed her example and were ambitious and urban and climbing the corporate ladder the way that she did. That's not Cricket's personality. So we do see a bit of conflict there. But I think, yeah, in relation to both of her parents, Cricket is able to take some of their better traits, learn from them, and we see her mother through her perspective for most of the book. But we do get to meet her mother at one point, and we get a little bit more of a perspective into who she is.
Well, and as we follow along Cricket's journey, one of my favorite things actually happens later on in the novel, and we're going to keep this as spoiler free as possible. But something happens with her father where it kind of started to get marketed on, and it was really fun to read about how that happened. And then the mom had a very different reaction to her sister. So we'd love for you to talk about the sister a little bit, because they both have very different approaches to caregiving. And it's because of Cricket's caregiving that led to this really oracle moment later on in the novel.
Yeah. So Nina is the older sister. She's 6 years older than Cricket. And for most of their lives, they've occupied those sort of stereotypical older sister, younger sister roles. Nina is very organized, responsible. She's a PhD. She initially was the one who was taking care of their father, whereas Cricket is the more aimless younger daughter who isn't quite sure who she is. Um, and Nina's approach to caregiving is more by the book, right? She has her father on a set schedule. They do the same things every day and every week. They have their routine. She's trying to keep him tethered to reality as she experiences it. And when Cricket takes over as caregiver, she has a different approach. You know, she's like, who cares if he thinks this cucumber is a pepperoni? Let's let him think that. She's a little bit more open-minded and able to let her father set the tone and to go where he leads. And in that process, she becomes aware that he's really tuned in to something beyond the here and now, possibly another dimension. It's a little bit ambiguous, but she creates space for that to flourish, for him to be able to bestow wisdom. He ends up receiving visitors who come to him for guidance. And rather than sort of tamp that down and say, this is ridiculous, we're not doing this, Cricket facilitates that process. She's very clear about not wanting to exploit her father. And as an author, I wanted to be clear about that as well. This is not a book about exploiting someone with a disease, but it's more about a father and daughter embarking on a creative project together where they both have agency and they're both sort of embracing the unknown and seeing where it takes them. Yeah, so ultimately Nina, the older sister, is very wary and a bit judgmental about this project, but Cricket's mother ultimately thinks it's pretty fascinating and is wondering if they can somehow monetize it.
Right. Well, and one thing that I love that you use the word agency, because that was something that jumped out to me in the sense of it made Arthur actually more alive. And I think we tend to sort of, when we hear a diagnosis or if we read about a character who's going through something like this, they tend to be very much, there was a character earlier in the novel that really dismissed Arthur's situation where he's just like, well, he's not going to remember me anyway, so what's the point of me hanging out with him? And so I wonder if empathy is also a part of this, where I don't think it's a fault of anyone who hasn't gone through this, or maybe there's a level of misunderstanding, but I think empathy plays a really big role, and oftentimes I feel like it's hard to understand what that person's going through. So that was kind of what I took away from Arthur, sort of going through this oracle experience. Was that your intention, or did that go through your mind when you were building this portion of the story?
Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes we talk about this disease as if the diagnosis is kind of like the end game. I wanted to tell a story where the diagnosis is just the beginning of the next chapter, and there's room for interesting, meaningful things to unfold in that chapter. I think, understandably, dementia can be a really awkward disease for everyone, right? We're not always sure where we stand with someone, if they'll remember us, and I think as a result, a lot of family members, friends, acquaintances, they can sort of just avoid it, right? By falling away, not visiting as often, avoiding conversations, just because they don't want to delve in that murky, I don't know what this person's thinking. I don't know if they know me, in that realm. So I understand why that happens. I also think it's so important to have people surrounding the patient who are just going to be there through the awkwardness, through the unknown, sort of riding it out with them. And in the case of this book, that's Cricket. It's also some new friends that she finds in the small town where they live, who are sort of unlikely friends for her. One is a woman in her 70s, her former dance teacher. One is a neighbor in his 50s who's just sort of a benevolent person who wants to help and wants to be in the mix, and they form a kind of like a funny gang of people who are up for adventure and who all seem to have a basic understanding that Arthur's worth is not defined by his cognitive abilities. The fact that he has this disease should not deter them from being good friends to him.
Well, and one thing that I really loved about this too is Arthur clearly needs help, but he's also still able to help others, whether or not he realizes that's what he's doing. And with the sort of Cricket finding a supportive community and sort of a found family back at home, what were you hoping to showcase to your readers in terms of Cricket finding a support system back in a place that where I think she didn't expect that, versus we start out the novel learning that Cricket is in New York and she was kind of alone there. She wasn't as she didn't really have a supportive community there.
I think it's so important to cultivate friendships with people of different ages and different backgrounds. I think sometimes, we can get locked into our peer group or the people we've gone to college with or who we work with, whatever that is. And when the book begins, Cricket she's sort of running with a crowd of 20 somethings in New York who are going out and having fun, but she feels alienated because she's dealing with a father who's in decline and her friends are not dealing with that. So I think at one point she says something like, I'm ready to be something other than young. She's not really enjoying her youth, at least not that version of youth. So I think when she does decide to move to this rural lake in the Adirondacks and she begins to find friends who she wouldn't have otherwise met or connected with, she realizes there are so many layers to life, so many different ways to find people you connect with, and sometimes breaking out of the expected path that you're on is exactly what you need in terms of finding who the right people are for you and figuring out who you want to be in the world.
We're hearing from author and Connecticut native Tory Henwood Hoen. Her latest book is Before I Forget. You can find a link to her book by visiting our show page, ctpublic.org/where we live. Coming up, we continue our conversation with Tory, and we'll also hear from the audiobook narrator who brought this book to life. And let us know if you want to hear more conversations about books and authors. Sign up for our Where We Read newsletter. It has a monthly rundown of what the Where We Live team is reading. It also includes highlights of some of the best author interviews on Connecticut Public. Listen back and find your next read at ctpublic.org/whereweread. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, author Tory Henwood Hoen is with us. She's a Connecticut native and author of 2 books, including her latest, Before I Forget. And now we're going to hear from the narrator of this new book. Recording an audiobook involves a lot more than just reading the book out loud. So let's have a quick preview of the audiobook.
I am stuck between selves. Right now, I am no one. I am also stuck literally in the mud, the wheels of my janky hatchback spinning in fruitless circles as they work themselves deeper into the earth. I should have known better than to drive up this particular road in this particular car at this particular time of year, but I forgot. It has been a while since I visited my father's house. More than a while. It has been 9 years. As I rev the engine, I recall his classic refrain, "If you visit during mud season, you must really mean it."
Joining us now is Barry Kreinick. She's the audiobook narrator for Before I Forget and also an actor and writer. Barry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I don't think it's often that we hear the person before we actually introduce the person. So that's an amazing first here. And so before we get into the art of narration, we'll love to hear more about how you and Tory know each other, because this is not the first time you cross paths. So what's the origin story?
Yes, so Tory and I both attended Renbrook School in West Hartford. Tory was a year ahead of me, so we didn't know each other super well initially, although we were both there from pre-K through 8th grade. But in 1997, when I was in 7th grade and Tory was in 8th grade, we were both cast in our school's production of You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. And I have some delightful photographs still from that production, which I shared with Tory recently. And all I can say is Tory was much cooler than I was in middle school.
Well,
but
now,
probably less talented.
no, but before we get into all of the details, I need to know what characters you guys played.
Okay, so in the original production, there were only 6 characters, but I think in the interest of casting as many kids as possible, our director added all the characters from the Peanuts gang, so there were 12 of us. So I played Patty, not Peppermint Patty, but the original Patty from the original cast, who was a friend of Lucy's, and Tory played Violet, Lucy's other friend. So we were kind of the mean girls.
Well, see, this is the kind of details that we need. And so what an amazing story. And because you guys went off and did your thing, and now you're reconnected in such a cool way. How did you decide to collaborate on this project? Tory,
well,
Barry,
Tory chime in too. No, we reconnected actually when I read Tory's first book, The Ark. We have a mutual friend who also went to Renbrook with us, and I read the book and reconnected with Tory at that point. That was about 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm. But coincidentally, my book was published by St. Martin's Press, and Barry had already begun doing work for that publisher as a narrator. So that was total coincidence. And then when I wrote my second book and it came time to select a narrator, I said to my editor, "Can we consider Barry?" And they said, "Yes. Let's done. She would be perfect for this." So it was an easy decision, and I'm so glad I got input. Sometimes authors don't get input into who narrates their books, but in this case, I handpicked Barry, and it was a great choice.
It just seems like something that Arthur would have predicted, and that this was going to happen, actually. And Barry, can you tell us a bit about your process as narrator? I know we got a glimpse earlier. Before you start recording, what happens behind the scenes as you prepare and develop the voices for these characters?
Sure. So the first thing that happens is I get sent the script. That's the book. I call it the script because I will be performing it. So that's sent to me as a PDF, usually about a month before I start recording, sometimes as little as 2 weeks. And I read the book through once. I put it in an app on my iPad that allows me to annotate the PDF. So the two main things that I do are I make a list of all the words that I don't know how to pronounce or any names that I want to know how the author wants them pronounced, if there are different possibilities. And then I send that list to the producer and they will reach out to the author. And I highlight all of the character dialogue in different colors so that I know at a glance who's speaking. And of course, read through the entire book so I know what happens and get a sense of the tone and the structure and who the characters are. And I start thinking about what sort of the character voices sort of start coming to me fairly naturally as I read. I start to hear them. Occasionally, I will rehearse them a little bit, depending on sort of the demographic, or if it's a kind of character I've never really voiced before, I'll just do a little sort of test run while I'm prepping. And then I bring that annotated PDF into the studio with me and I go. I occasionally hear from an author, usually in writing, again, through the producer. In this case, the producer was Macmillan Audio, saying, here I have some notes about these characters, like these are my thoughts about how they should sound. In this case, because I already knew Tory, I just got to have a phone conversation with her, which was lovely, and say, okay, what are you thinking about Cricket's voice, about Arthur's voice, about Gemma's voice? And to get that input was really helpful, to just sort of be able to have that conversation live beforehand.
And
I had some thoughts about how I envisioned these characters sounding, but really I just trusted Barry to run with it. She's so talented. She has so much range and depth and emotional intelligence. I knew that her instincts would work. Yeah, there was one moment when we were talking and she said, well, how do you want me to handle this part? Because there's a moment in the book where the cat's toes graze the keyboard and create a bunch of gibberish, just like R, backslash. And she was like, how do you think I should read that? I was kind of like, just do your best.
So you have some freedom there, Barry.
Yes.
And was there something about the book that you connected with in particular? Or a character that you connected with?
Definitely. So unlike Tory, I have not had a member of my immediate family experience memory loss, but my father died in 2018 after a short illness. And then later that year, a friend of mine who was like a godmother to me died of cancer, and I was one of her primary caregivers at the end of her life. So between the experience of losing a parent and the experience of caring for an ill adult, there was much in this book that I related to, and I just thought Tory captured those experiences so accurately, and that the humor for me was a huge part of that, because even though those were two major losses in my life, there was a lot of laughter in both of those processes. And I thought that element and just some of it's, I mean, I picked up particular phrases and said to Tory, this is so true, you know. So yeah, I related to the book very, very deeply on a personal level.
Well, I'm sorry to hear about your losses. And I mean, this kind of goes back to what Tory and I were talking about earlier, is humor playing a big role when it comes to caregiving or when it comes to grieving or loss. And not for everybody, of course, but I think it seems like anecdotally I've been hearing from a lot of people that it does help to laugh. And it is okay to laugh when you're talking about or experiencing something that can be sad or if you're grieving. And clearly this was something that you related with your own experiences with caregiving. Do you think it helped you in terms of knowing that, oh, there is someone out there who also uses laughter and humor when it comes to these things, and I feel better that I'm doing the same?
Definitely. And particularly on the level of this being a published book, because I thought how wonderful to be putting this story out there for even more people to say, oh, I relate to this, or I hope that if I have to go through an experience like this, that there is this much joy and beauty in it, in addition to struggle and tragedy.
And Barry, you're also a writer yourself. Curious to hear, how does being a writer inform your narrating technique?
Well, sometimes it makes me want to edit books, which is not a useful impulse. That's not my job, so I try to quell that impulse. But mostly it makes me very aware of honoring the author's intentions. Because when I write, particularly when I write plays to be performed by other actors, which is something I've done, I'm very deliberate, not only in choosing the words that I'm using, but also punctuation and phrasing and spacing and stuff like that. And my hope is that the actors performing it will honor those things because they're all in there for a reason. So I operate always with a sort of honor the text is the first priority. So when it comes to an audiobook, that means when I'm creating character voices, let's say, the first thing I'm going to look for is what has the author said about this character? I'm not just going to make something up out of thin air. It's going to be, has the author written something about how they sound? Tory had some very specific phrasing about Gemma's accent. And I got to then ask Tory about, like, what exactly do you mean by that? Because I wanted to make sure my interpretation of it was what she was hearing in her mind, or as close to that as possible. So I think coming at it from that perspective as a writer, always my priority is what is it the author wants and how can I bring that to life as well as possible.
Well, and Tory, curious to hear, the moment you heard your book literally come to life in audio form, what went through your mind?
It's always a bit surreal. And, in this case, knowing Barry and just seeing what she did with it was so exciting. I think to me, it doesn't feel like, oh, someone's taking my work and doing something different with it. It really just feels like they're adding a whole new layer, bringing it to life in a way that you can't really do on the page. So to me, and I have heard from people who said I both read the physical book and I listened to some of the audio, and they're so complimentary, and it was wonderful shifting back and forth. So I think that is so fun that we can read that way in this day and age, that you can hold the physical book and also get to hear the voice of the narrator and feel the characters come to life in that way. It just makes for like a really enriching reading experience overall.
Well, and with what Barry just shared, the process and also personal experiences, it seems like the experience of caregiving does touch on a lot of people. And oftentimes when caregivers, non-professional caregivers, family members find themselves in these situations, really not by choice, kind of similar to what happened with Cricket. And do you think that's something that resonates with a lot of people? Are you hearing from readers that have shared their own experiences?
Yes, and this has been by far the most gratifying and unexpected part of writing this book for me. I knew that I was taking a bit of a risk in writing about Alzheimer's in this way, where I was sort of leaning into the levity of it and taking a different tack with my narrative. And my big concern was, will this resonate with caregivers or with people who have firsthand experience of Alzheimer's? And I really hope that it did. Luckily, I've heard from dozens and dozens of readers who have said, wow, this was such a refreshing way to read about this topic. It reminded me of my father, or of, my own experience with caregiving. Or people who have said, my family has just experienced a diagnosis, and this is helping me to feel a little bit more optimistic about how things might play out. So that for me has just been surprising in the most wonderful way, to hear that this book is not just entertaining people, but giving them a sense of hope and a bit of a reframe in terms of how they thought Alzheimer's needs to go.
Well, and
I just want to respond,
to
what you just said about choice, because something that I find really interesting about the book is that Cricket chooses to do this. There's a conversation in the beginning with her sister about maybe we should put him in a facility, and Cricket says, no, I'm going to do this. Not really knowing what it's going to entail, but feeling like it's the right choice for her. And that was what happened to me with my friend. Because she was a widow, she didn't have children. I was among, a sort of small circle of close friends. And I just thought, this is what I have to do right now. I don't know why, and I don't know what it's going to involve, but I'm here, and I love this person, and I'm going to do this. And you learn a lot from that. And it actually can be, many, many people obviously are put in that position not by choice, but I think it can be a profoundly illuminating experience. And as difficult as it was, I feel like it changed me in some very positive ways.
Well, and I wonder, Barry, how, if it did impact the way you recorded and performed the book, knowing Tory's story and having gone through your own experiences. For example, one of my friends does a lot of work in voicing. And one of the things that he has shared with me is ultimately it all comes down to technique. So emotions for him doesn't play as much of a role as people tend to think it does. So ultimately for him, it's more sort of the technical technique. Is it the same for you, or does your own personal experience and Tori's experience kind of help you do the performances?
So I feel that my job as an actor, whether I'm on a stage or narrating an audiobook, is to allow the audience to have an emotional response. It's not about listening to me have an emotional response. It's about evoking that for them. That being said, part of acting technique for me is sort of what I call reaching into my emotional well and sort of bringing out whatever of my own experience is going to help me play the scene that I'm playing, not in a specific methody substitution kind of way where I'm thinking about myself while I'm playing a scene. It's not really about that. It's hard to describe. It's more almost metaphysical, where I'm just going, okay, I'm bringing, this quality or this emotion. And I had a strange experience recording this book that I'd never had before, which was, there's a very emotional scene toward the end of the book. And I got so emotional I couldn't continue. And I said, I need a break. And the engineer left the booth. And I sat there trying to pull myself together, and I thought, okay, what am I going to do? Because this is too close to my own experience for me to be able to continue, allowing the emotions to flow in this way. Like, again, my job is to give an experience to the listener, not for them to listen to me having this experience. So I thought, okay, we're going to put a cap on the emotional well. And that's where you fall back on your technique. My acting teacher in grad school used to say there is an element of acting in acting, which means sometimes you have to know that it's pretend and you tell the story. And I thought, I'm going to re-enter this with a focus on telling Cricket's story in a way that's as clear as possible to elicit those emotions in the listener. And it's no longer about me and my emotional experience, it's about her. So that's what I did.
Well, you remind me, I think it was Laurence Olivier that said in response to someone asking him about method acting, and he goes, "It's acting, my dear."
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Well, and I think similar question to you, Tori, as we go to break soon here, but curious to hear too, when it comes to writing, is it similar to you in terms of technique versus emotion or emotion versus technique?
For me, it's all mixed up together. My writing process is pretty chaotic, but I think I'm learning that success comes from staying rooted in emotion, real emotional experience, whatever the plot or the specific theme I'm working with. Trying to make sure that those human emotions feel authentic is really where like the value of the story lies. And for me as a writer, I wanted this to be an emotional arc for Cricket, her maturation process. That's really what this book is about, even though it has various other bells and whistles plot-wise. This is really about Cricket's own late coming-of-age story. And I gave that challenge to Barry as well with the narration. I said, at the beginning of this book, Cricket is in one emotional place. She's a bit closed off. She's a little bit cynical. By the end of the book, I want her to be in a different place. And I hope that we can make that tangible through the narration. And I think it was subtle, but Barry did a beautiful job of honoring that arc with her narration.
With us today is Tory Henwood Hoen, who's the author of 2 books, including her latest, Before I Forget, and also Barry Krynick, who's an actor, writer, and audiobook narrator for Before I Forget and several other audiobooks. Coming up, we hear from one Connecticut organization working to bring books to people with visual impairment and other disabilities. That's next here on Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. The world of audiobooks has taken off in recent years, making reading on the go more available for all. But long before you could download an audiobook directly from your local library, the Connecticut Library for Accessible Books has been recording and bringing not just audiobooks, but talking books to those with visual impairments and other disabilities. Joining us now to talk about it is Matt Giza. He's the director of the Connecticut Library for Accessible Books. Matt, pleasure to have you here.
Hello, good to be here with you.
So, mentioned talking books just now. Can you give us an idea of how are talking books different from audiobooks that you might download from whatever platform you're downloading audiobooks from?
Sure. Talking books is a phrase that goes back actually to the 1930s, and it specifically refers to books that were recorded from print books to be made available to folks who qualify for service from CT Lab, but also we have a federal partner that really organizes all of this, and they're the National Library Service for the blind and print disabled. So talking books is really something that refers to somebody who a book that's recorded specifically for somebody using the service. And audiobooks, from what I understand, is a phrase that came in a little later, a few decades later. So, recorded books really originated with this service, NLS, the National Library Service.
And is there anything different about audiobooks versus talking books in terms of what's being recorded?
So aside from the intended audience that we just mentioned, there are some technical differences. Right now, what it means is if you are accessing talking books, you're using specialized equipment or the NLS's download service, which is known as BARD, and that's BARD. That stands for Braille and Audio Reading Download Service. It's not possible to listen to a talking book unless you're registered for the service. Audiobooks, are of course commercially produced and made for a wider audience.
So it sounds like the accessibility level for talking books might be a little bit more than audiobooks.
That's often the case. Now that things are in digital format, that's shifting a little bit. But what our federal partner, the National Library Service, is striving to do is replicate the same kind of reading experience that you would get from a print book. So they take a lot of efforts post-production to make sure that there's the markup that's necessary so that when somebody's reading a talking book using the digital talking book machine or using BARD, they're able to navigate to all of the different sections of the book, just like a reader using the print text would use. The other thing that, in my experience, is that a lot of the talking books from NLS tend to make sure that they're also including audio descriptions of any visual material that's within the book. That's not always the case with commercial books, but I don't want to say they don't do it at all.
So here in Connecticut, we do have a few libraries who are even recording audiobooks for the initiative. So can you tell us more about that?
Sure. The organization is known as Talking Books CT/CVSBH, and they're a volunteer organization that we partner with. As you mentioned, they have recording studios in 3 Connecticut public libraries, Ridgefield, Milford, and Southbury. And the way it works is that they have teams of volunteers that record the books. And when they complete the book, they send it off to receive that markup that we talked about in post-production. And then the books return to us at the Connecticut Library for Accessible Books. And what we do is then we're able to transfer that book to NLS so it can be made available not only for residents here in Connecticut that are using our service, but because it can be made available on BARD, it can then be used by a patron who is an NLS patron nationwide and access that book.
Well, and tell us more about the Connecticut Library for Accessible Books. How did this first get started, and what are some of the other services that people can check out?
Sure. So the Connecticut Library for Accessible Books was formerly known as the Connecticut State Library for the Blind and Physically Handicapped, and we changed our name back in 2023. But the service dates here in Connecticut to 1968. We're part of the Connecticut State Library, which is the state library agency for Connecticut. And we're specifically cited within the State Library's Division of Library Development, which is concerned with supporting statewide library services. For patrons of the Connecticut Library for Accessible Books, and if it's okay with you, I'll use CT Lab as the shortened form of our name. For CT Lab patrons, they have access to materials that are the talking books that we've been discussing, but also Braille materials. And patrons can elect to, sort of access any of these materials or any combination of these materials. We are designed to be a remote service, which means that most of our patrons are receiving materials through one of 2 methods. Either some items are sent through U.S. mail, and other items are downloaded from BARD, like we talked about, which is the digital download service from our federal partner, the National Library Service. Items that travel through U.S. mail, for example, are hard copy Braille books. We have digital talking book machines that I referenced. These, for listeners, these are sort of the equivalent of a tabletop cassette player. And they play specially designed USB flash drive cartridges that we call talking book cartridges, and we load the talking books directly onto those cartridges. Those are sent through U.S. mail as well. And then, folks who are using Bard, the download service, they are downloading materials themselves, and they can do that through a web browser, through the Bard mobile app. They can also use a desktop application that's known as Bard Express. And right now, NLS is piloting a My Talking Book skill, which is for Amazon smart speakers.
So many potential here, I think, to
Right.
to sort of expand readership. And you mentioned that you service many library patrons with visual impairments. But talking books can also service a number of other people living with disabilities. Can you tell us more about who might be eligible for these books in the communities you serve?
Absolutely. Broadly speaking, we serve any individual who is blind or also has any other form of print disability. And you heard that being the second part of the National Library Service for the Blind and Print Disabled. Print disability just kind of refers to any disability that makes it challenging for somebody to use a print book or other printed material. NLS does establish a eligibility criteria that we follow, and right now that includes anyone who is blind or who has any kind of visual impairment or has low vision. We also can serve Connecticut residents who have a perceptual or reading disability, and anyone who has a physical disability that makes it challenging for them to use a print book. This could be a physical disability where they're not unable to hold the book or turn the pages, or perhaps their eyes aren't able to focus on the page for an extended period of time.
Well, and so this is a subject that comes up a bit because oftentimes we hear from a camp of readers who say audiobooks don't count as, quote, real reading. How do you respond to that?
Well, the NLS has a slogan right now that is that all may read, and I think this really encapsulates our philosophy at the Connecticut Library for Accessible Books. As far as we're concerned, reading is reading regardless of format, so that includes print materials, audio materials, as well as Braille materials.
I think it's safe to say many Connecticut authors would agree with you. And I want to bring Tory Henwood Hoen real quick back, just listening to what Barry just said. Any thoughts? Audiobooks as real reading?
Absolutely real reading. To me, the format is, secondary. If you're consuming the story, you are reading, and participating in that process is so important to support authors like me and publishing, especially in this crazy world of AI. I don't care how you read my book. I just care that you enjoy the story.
And really quickly here, Barry, 30 seconds. What are your thoughts about audiobook as reading or not reading?
Absolutely, it's reading. You're consuming what has been written, whether you are hearing the voices in your own head by reading it off the page or listening to me or another narrator deliver those voices into your ears. You are receiving the story, and that's really what matters.
And really quickly here, Matt, if you want to let our listeners know if they want or know someone who needs these services, how can they contact you?
Yeah, so welcome to call us, and they can reach us at 860-704-2220, or we have an 800 number, which is toll-free for in-state callers, and that's 800-842-4516.
And all of this information will be available on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive and /whereweread. Matt Giza, Director of the Connecticut Library for Accessible Books, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
You're also listening to Tory Henwood Hoen, who's the author of Before I Forget, as well as Barry Krenek, who narrated the book. Thank you, Tory and Barry, for joining us as well.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Jean Amatruda. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you all so much for listening. And as always, happy reading, everyone.